Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibiers, welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Good to have you here. It's Friday. I took yesterday evening off. Court ended early. There's no court today, picking back up at 10:30 Eastern on Monday. So I just took a little time to hang out with my kids and start binging the new Fallout series because I love the game. If you're watching on YouTube, you know the drill. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Like the video, share it with your friends, and you can ring my bell if you want notifications of when I post new content. Music fact of the day. The song Hit Me Baby One More Time was actually lost in translation. It was written by two Swedish songwriters who thought the word hit meant call. So the meaning of the song is actually call me baby one more time, but it doesn't hit the same, does it? I was sort of debating about how deep I was going to go into Detective Hermosillo's testimony from yesterday because it is extremely graphic. It's kind of ironic having a true crime podcast and you don't like going into the graphic details of how people were found or how they were killed. But I think this is important to the whole story because this is the reality of why we're here. So just a huge trigger warning. I will be getting into his testimony, and I completely understand that may be a very sensitive thing for people to hear. So this is your warning. If you are sensitive to this kind of information, you may want to skip this episode, but it is part of their story. And ultimately, it's why we're here. It's why Lori Vallow is spending the rest of her life in prison and why there's a good possibility Chad Daybell could get the death penalty in this case. True crime's never pleasant, but I think it's important to tell the whole story, to tell what happened to these kids. When we left off on Wednesday, we were talking about the search warrant on Chad's property that they executed in June of 2020. This is the day they found the kids' bodies. They were led to this location by the location pings on Alex Cox's Google account, Homer J. Maximus, that was logged in on his phone and essentially led investigators right to the bodies of JJ and Tylee. We got to the part where they had excavated the ground to where they could see something around, poking through the dirt. Detective Hermosillo talked about how to them it became clear this was the crown of a human head. They kept excavating the area, and once they cleared away all the earth, they saw a small body wrapped in a plastic bag. They made a small cut in the bag, and it revealed another bag. And when they cut through the second bag, human hair came out. It was brown. We know over the years, Chad was a gravedigger. And one thing that stood out to me when I was at Lori's trial last year, looking at these photos in person, is how precisely this grave was dug. It was about 4 by 2. And the roots to the tree were cut. Now, you couple that with the fact that Alex was not on that property, but maybe 17 minutes, if I'm remembering correctly. It was the shortest amount of time Alex had been on Chad's property between the two burial days. With Tylee, it was over 2 hours. Hopefully, this is something the jury connects the dots with, that you have somebody like Chad who's very experienced at digging graves, and you look at the time Alex was on that property, it is not proportionate. As far as what would have needed to be done. Once JJ's body was taken out, Detective Hermosillo assisted the coroner and other officers in putting JJ in a body bag. It was then transferred to the coroner's vehicle. The coroner and a deputy drove to the morgue, and Detective Hermosillo followed behind. Once they finished everything they needed to do at the coroner's office, Detective Hermosillo went back to Chad's residence. He started working around that fire pit area again where Tylee's remains were found. Last year at Lori's trial, we saw most of these photos. There were a few that were just too graphic that only the jury was allowed to see. I went back and looked at my notes from last year of the photos. They're really hard to see on the screen. And so I'm just going to go through and explain some of the photos that were shown yesterday that we did not get to see. And I will tell you, nobody wants to see these photos. They are some of the worst. The soil looked different as they dug down, and you just see parts of Tylee. They show close-ups of tissue and bone photos. They show this melted green bucket that also had remains in it. There was a photo of a partial skull. They had to get on their hands and knees in order to excavate this gravesite, and the smell was so bad they could only work a few minutes at a time and they would have to be relieved. They also found part of a jawbone under that green bucket. There was one big mass that they tried to remove and it just fell apart. When they dug deeper, they did find some teeth. They showed a photo of what was inside the bucket, which was a partial skull and other parts of Tylee. Detective Hermosillo did attend the autopsy of JJ. They met with the medical examiner. They were briefed about what they were about to go through. So they dressed up and they were signed in. At that point, staff brought out the remains of JJ. They open the bag, they take photos, and they start cutting into the plastic bags to reveal the remains. Detective Hermosillo saw a little boy in red pajamas, which we know that's what JJ was wearing when they took the last photo of him. Trigger warning again, there was a white plastic bag around his head. There was duct tape from chin to his forehead, and his arms were duct taped with several layers, and his feet were bound. Detective Hermosillo said the amount of duct tape on JJ's arms really caught his attention, and it was a lot. It was absolutely a lot. I remember that photo very clearly. There was a child's blanket on top of him. There was just layer upon layer of duct tape on JJ. When they got the duct tape that was covering his face completely off, there was duct tape from jawline to jawline. They cut away the duct tape from his hands and it just exposed more duct tape. Detective Hermosillo stayed for the entire autopsy, and he said once all of the duct tape was removed, he was able to visually identify that that was JJ Vallow. The PJs were wet from decomposition. He had a pull-up diaper on, and he had visible bruising on his arms, ankles, and his chest. He had scratch marks on his neck just below that duct tape. It's just a horrifying thought, all of it. After the autopsy, the pathologist brought in Tylee's remains. They opened up the body bag, and the pathologist said there wasn't anything they were going to do at that time with the autopsy, so they left. They went back to the coroner's office on June 12th, and Lieutenant Ron Ball took custody of the evidence, and that was transferred to the state lab in Meridian. At this point, Fremont County was investigating Tammy's death at the same time they were investigating the children. So moving back, they talk about the fact that Fremont County was investigating Tammy Daybell's death at the same time they were investigating the missing children. The different agencies would meet to discuss the case and help each other and just share information. On October 9th, Alex tries to shoot Tammy Daybell. Detective Hermosillo learned of this from the Fremont County Sheriff's Office. He said he was advised. John Pryor objects and says the question is whether he was advised, not what he was advised of. Well, prosecutor Rob Wood's like, totally don't understand this objection. Judge Boyce is like, me either. He just tells Detective Hermosillo to keep on with his answer. And they just bring up the fact that Tammy reported that she was shot at by someone with what she thought was a paintball gun. Cross-examination is painful, y'all. Everybody's entitled to a defense. I support that 100%. Cross is painful, and this could be a very, very long trial with John Pryor. His aggressive tactic in questioning the witnesses, I don't think is going to sit well with the jury. Detective Hermosillo, I will tell you, is a sweetheart. And it's very clear when they're on the stand how deeply what they've seen in this case still affects them to this day. I don't think that John Pryor's aggressive style of cross-exam is going to sit well with the jury, but he's been very consistent in his aggressive style since the beginning. He starts off by essentially sort of questioning Detective Hermosillo about fundamentals in investigations, like you're not supposed to judge or narrow that role as a police officer to a particular person as a suspect. He says focusing on one person and saying we assume this person did this and then building a case around that person would be inappropriate. Detective Hermosillo agrees with both of those points. The defense asked, what do you do with all that evidence? And the detective says, we follow the evidence and then we put a case together and we give it to the prosecutor. The defense says there's a distinct role in an investigation and your job is to look at all the possible evidence and not make a determination, correct? And he says yes. Defense attorney Pryor says it's not the job of the prosecutor to show up during an investigation and interview witnesses, right? Detective Hermosillo said it actually depends on the case. He has had prosecutors show up to question witnesses. The defense says if you're remaining neutral in an investigation, you're supposed to be neutral, right? Hermosillo's like, yep. At this point, the prosecution objects, saying that defense attorney Pryor's being argumentative and that is sustained. He goes on and asked if prosecutors interviewing witnesses and giving their personal opinions on a case is appropriate. And if you're name calling and judging people's character at this point, there's an objection, is sustained again. The defense asked if he carries a cell phone and if it has the technology to record and videotape, and he says yes. They talk about the welfare check on November 26, 2019, And he asked who he was with that day. And he said it was Detective Hope, Detective Stubbs, and Lieutenant Ron Ball. He's asked when the other two showed up. He said, when I called, based on lies we had been told. The defense asked if anybody recorded these lies with their phones, and he said no. They move on to when Chad was asked about having Lori's number. Pryor says he's confused. You asked Chad first if he had Lori's phone number? The detective says no, he didn't talk to Chad until after he had already talked to Alex. He asked if at any time he threatened Chad to turn his phone over, and the detective says no. Defense attorney Pryor said, did any officer say if you don't turn this phone over, you're going to get in a lot of trouble? And the detective says no. The defense says your testimony is Chad refused to give you Lori's number at first, and he says that's correct. Without any further prompting, he shows back up and gives you the phone number later. The detective says he never showed back up because he never left after I asked him the first time. I had to ask him twice to give me the phone number. He's asked how much time passed between that first and second request, and the detective says roughly a minute. So the defense says without any prompting and within 30 seconds, he gave it. The detective says it wasn't until when Detective Hope started to walk over to them and he asked again that he actually gave it over. And then Pryor's like, so you had to ask him twice? And Detective Hermosillo said yes. He moves on, and this was very confusing to me, but he really is trying to drive home the point that Tammy Daybell thought this was a paintball gun. The defense says, you later decided it was a shooting. Is that the words you used? Detective Hermosillo says, probably. Pryor gets a little snippy and says, you were just here testifying a few minutes ago and you used the word shooting, and he says yes. He's asked about looking over all the evidence in this case, and did you get a chance to look at the facts and circumstances surrounding the attempt on Tammy Daybell October 9th. You use the word shooting. And then he says, you don't think Tammy Daybell was shot at with anything other than a paintball gun, do you? And Detective Hermosillo's like, yes, sir, I do. He's asked, what do you base that off of? He's asked if he knew whether or not Alex was at the Daybell residence at the time of the attempted shooting. And the detective says no, he was there earlier. Alex made Google searches about shooting through a Dodge Dakota, which was a car owned by the Daybells that Tammy drove. There's some back and forth about asking who was driving that Dodge Dakota, and ultimately, Judge Boyce told Pryor to move on. One thing to note, it was a really cold night in Rexburg the night Tammy was shot at. Detective Hermosillo mentions that on the day of the attempt, Alex Googled how to make an AR function in cold weather. And the morning of the attempt, Alex drove up and down the road that was near Chad Daybell's property. Alex drove up and down the road and was also on Chad's property that morning. That's one of the reasons he thinks it wasn't a paintball gun. And he said, we think Alex was there to shoot Tammy Daybell. Pryor mentions that Alex Cox was searching on October 12th, 3 days after the attempt for sharpening swords. And then also on October 23rd, Alex Googled 15 facts about the Silence of the Lambs you didn't know. The detective doesn't remember that search. Defense attorney Pryor points out that Chad is not charged in the murder of Charles or the attempt on Brandon. They move on to the welfare check, and Detective Hermosillo said they tried to call Chad, but every time it went to voicemail. The defense asked who was in the apartment the last time JJ was seen. We know that's Melanie Gibb and David Warwick. The defense asked about an interview that the detective had with Gibb and David Warwick in Utah and asked if he recorded it. The detective said the recorder malfunctioned in the beginning of the interview. And the defense asked if he got around 22 minutes of that interview recorded. And Detective Hermosillo said that didn't sound right because the interview was about an hour long. The prosecution objects and says this is beyond the scope. That is sustained. And Pryor kind of gives them a little warning. He says this will be revisited when he's called back to the stand. The defense asked if JJ had the red pajamas on when Alex was seen carrying JJ upstairs the night JJ was last seen alive, and the detective doesn't know. On a redirect, the prosecution asked why he doesn't think it was a paintball gun used in the attempt on Tammy. He said because Alex was at Chad's that morning and also Googled how to make your AR-15 function in the cold weather. They just believe Alex was there to shoot Tammy Daybell, and she died 10 days later, and 17 days after her death, Chad is getting married in Hawaii. And that's really where testimony ended. Again, Detective Hermosillo may be up and down on the stand throughout the trial. He's the lead investigator on this case. He didn't miss a day last year of trial. So far, the testimony, I can compare my notes to Lori's trial last year, and it's pretty much identical as we thought. The facts of the case are the same for the most part. So I do expect the prosecution's case to be really similar to what we heard last year, but I do think there's going to be some new things to come in. So we will pick back up on Monday morning. Don't forget, about an hour before trial starts, about 9:30 Eastern, I'll start that live stream. Hopefully hop on and chit chat a bit. Then we'll watch that testimony together and see what next week brings. All right, guys, that's it for today. Hope you have a good rest of your weekend. We'll see you soon.